Next, I'm going to discuss with you the key events in the Arab Spring. Different events were happened in 2010 and onwards, but let me discuss with you the most important events that happened. Like in 2010, Mohamed Bouazizi set himself afire outside a local government office, and an act of protest after being arrested by police for not having a permit to run a vegetable stall. Street protests began soon after his death throughout the country. Likewise, in January 2011, the Tunisian president Zainul Abidin Ben Ali resigns and flees to Saudi Arabia. In the same year, the first coordinated mass protests are held in Tahrir Square in Cairo, in Egypt. Also in 2011, protesters in several predominantly Muslim countries, it's called the days of Rake, to oppose authoritarian governments and push for democratic reforms. Like Egypt's Hosni Mubarak steps down in 2011. Pro-democracy protests begin in Syria. Police beat thousands of pro-democracy protesters in Morocco. Like in 2011, the Moroccan protesters approve constitutional changes that limit the power of the country's monarchy. The rebels in Libya, they launch battle to take control of Tripoli. Yemen's hold a million man march, a large scale pro-democracy protest. Libyan dictator Colonel Muammar Gaddafi is captured by rebels, tortured and killed. These were some of the important events that happened in an Arab Spring. Next, I'm going to discuss with you the emergence of four wars. When millions of disconnected citizens first looked to the streets in Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, Libya, and Yemen, is in rapid successions between December 2010 and April 2011. Protests were somewhat new in their expectations and certainly ill prepared. They didn't have a plan of actions beyond mobilizing large numbers of people. They didn't have well articulated manifestos or even lists of demands beyond generic mantras like freedom, dignity, and the dictator must go. These were their demands. Not only were they not organized for a long-term struggle to change the regime, many rejected on principle even the idea of creating formal organizations like political parties, believing the hierarchies were anti-democratic and leadership should remain diffuse. On the other side of the divide, the governments remained supremely confident that they didn't have to make serious concessions to remain in control. If some in the ranks of the elite believed reform was necessary, they didn't have much influence. The military took direct control in Egypt, forcing the military, they forces President Hosni Mubarak to step aside. The leaders of Libya, Syria, and Yemen fought to stay in power, and their stubbornness eventually triggered civil wars. The Gulf Arab monarchies simply distributed billions to their citizens and to all possible organizations without giving serious thought to the possibility of political reform. Only the king of Morocco, he proved more settled. At the first sign of protests, he quickly engineered constitutional reform. And the fact to left his power enact, but gave opposition parties a greater role in governance. Tunisia emerged as the only country where an uprising led to real political change, in part more by accident than by design. President Zainul Abidin bin Ali left to take his family to Saudi Arabia for safety, intending to return immediately to set things straight. But he was prevented from going back. The resulting power vacuum led to an open-ended process of change that birthed a multi-party democracy. Although protesters soon lost control over unfolding events, the uprising had real consequences, some affecting the entire region and others specific countries. First, all Arab governments are now taking the complaints and demands of their citizens more seriously. They have learned through direct experiences or by observing uprising in neighboring countries that they can no longer count on their citizens to remain silent like as in the past. Just before the uprising in Egypt, we were assured by a high-ranking political official that President Hosni Mubarak would have to trouble transferring power to his son because Egyptians were docile people. No Arab official would make such a statement today, not out of political correctness, but because rulers have learned the hard way that even usually passive citizens can rise up. Governments have developed a new fear of their citizens, which unfortunately tends to transform into repressions rather than recognition of political rights. Citizens, for their part, they haven't lost all fear of government, but they have gained a new sense of the power of the street and a new willingness to challenge governments. Let me discuss with you the conclusion. As you all know that street protests have become a normal part of political life in Pakistan and the rest of the world. It's also happening in the Arab world today, just as they are elsewhere. It is worthwhile pointing out that one of the most enduring legacies of the French revolutions, the French revolutions happened in 1789, is the propensity of French citizens to take to the streets whenever they disagree with the government of today. Most changes that have occurred since 2011 are specific to particular countries or regions. It is easier to understand what is happening by accepting that there is no single Arab word, but four words, which each affected by the uprising in different and distant ways. Space will only allow us to point briefly to some of the most notable outcomes to give to readers or listeners a sense of how different the consequences have been. I think that's enough for today. Thanks for watching my video. Kindly subscribe my channel so that because I will upload next lectures in upcoming futures so that you can get it easily. Thank you once again and best of luck.